So everyone, as I said, our first session is the Tech Masterclass, which is on global standards in biometric and digital identity. And I'd like you all to give a round of applause and welcome our first speaker of the day, Mr. Ameya Bhagwat, the Senior Vice President of Global Sales, Tech 5. And I'd like to tell you that we'll be taking up questions after this session. And please pay attention to this. This is a real important one. Mr. Ameya, over to you.
Hello. I hope you can hear me. Okay. Good morning to everyone. Good morning to the people who have joined in virtually. Thanks for the lovely introduction, and thanks to all our title partners as well as the supporting partners. I'm going to speak today, as was mentioned, on global standards in biometrics and digital identity. So to give you a background of what I'll do is I'll go into some background about what's happening in the identity space related to biometrics, why standards are important, what kind of standards are available today, what kind of standards may be applicable to innovative technologies, delve into why digital identity today is important, and leave you with a very innovative solution, and also something that we are planning to collaborate with NPCI on related to the UPI product. Yeah. So having said that, let's move ahead. Let me start off with a typical digital ID value chain. This is actually how it's defined by the USAID related to what's happening in the space. Any kind of an identity system today, right, if you really look at it, goes through these three typical phases. The first one is where you actually have an enrollment, where there is some kind of an identity that gets generated. It may be related to biometrics, may not be related to biometrics. Depending on whether you have some kind of quality control processes or not, those get implemented, and then once you are enrolled into a database, you basically get a credential. While here it's being depicted as a smart card, it need not necessarily be a smart card. It can be as good as your username and password also, right? And then you use whatever credential has been issued to you to actually go and avail services. And that's where the key benefit comes in, right? Where we say that an identity should not only be issued, but also should be used to avail services. That's where the authentication piece comes into picture, where from a relying party perspective, if you go and avail a service, the relying party wants to check into their database whether whatever person has come is actually a genuine person or not before actually authorizing the service delivery. So this is at a high level how the ID value chain is comprised of. Now, having said that, you could actually apply it to even biometrics, and we will see that in the slide in the coming slides. But really, what's happening today in biometrics, right? There is a lot of innovation that has happened. While biometrics as a technology has been present for a very long time, it was practically introduced by the FBI from a forensic perspective, and then slowly it has come into mainstream civil identity perspective and moved into commercial use. We all are familiar with this, where today all of us are using smartphones which have a Face ID or some kind of a fingerprint scanning on it. It's almost become a part of our lives, where every time that we open up a phone, we actually look into the phone and it allows us to gain an access. Facial biometrics is almost ubiquitous right now. We are very familiar with it, though we probably all of us may not understand the nitty-gritties of it, but we know that as soon as we look at the phone, it will allow us to perform a transaction or download an app or something of that sort. But there is also a gradual move towards contactless fingerprint technology, right? And this is what innovation that we are looking at in the market. We all are used to scanning our fingerprints on the mobile phone by touching it. But what we are seeing is there is a huge market out there, especially for civil identity systems, where touchless scanning or contactless fingerprint scanning is becoming a norm. The main difference over here is that when you look at fingerprint sensors that are there in the phone, they are very small, right? And I'm pretty sure all of you would have enrolled into your phone fingerprint system. It does not allow you to do that at one shot. It asks you to put your fingerprint in all different directions. The only reason for that is it wants to capture the full area because the sensor size is too small, right? So some of those challenges are already existing, which is why if you would have seen, most of these sensors today do not allow you to perform online authentication with the Aadhaar, right? Because they are not standardized as such. So having said that, this is just a short video of how a contactless technology looks like. We have put this slide here to introduce to you a concept that while you're capturing fingerprints using a smartphone back camera, you want to ensure that whatever is being captured can also be used to match with some kind of a legacy database, right? It should not be that whatever you're capturing is practically useless, right? It should not be garbage data. And that's where you want to ensure that whenever there is a new technology that is introduced, it's actually adhering or complying to certain standards so that whatever is the output of that capture actually gets used with legacy databases or in any case when you are enrolling new databases. I spoke about introducing biometrics into the digital ID value chain. I'm going to use this slide, which is actually what we designed to explain our technologies. So whatever you saw on the first slide, right, it's just being depicted in a very different way. Whenever we talk about biometrics, we use biometrics because it signifies uniqueness. You want to ensure that whoever is getting enrolled into the database is actually a unique person. So the first stage is actually capturing it. While here we are talking about contactless capture, we have seen that in numerous programs, including the Aadhaar project, we have actually gone and enrolled at a particular station using your all 10 fingerprints, facial and iris. So that becomes the main capture component where quality of data is extremely important, which then gets translated to a backend where you talk about the identification piece over here. That actually performs a 1:n, which guarantees that the identities are unique, right? And once the 1:n is passed, there can be a optional process of issuing a credential. In case of India, with Aadhaar, you get the Aadhaar number or the card. And practically in India, we could just use the Aadhaar number to go ahead and then avail these services by using the fourth piece over here, which is the authentication piece, right? So that's where we are introducing biometric as a concept. So just to summarize, what are the trends and innovations in biometrics? There is a lot of stuff happening on the contactless technology. There is a lot of stuff happening in the digital ID. But then as we go along, right, we have so far seen matching algorithms being traditional mathematical models of how matching is done. But that's being translated to neural networks where today, by far, if you look at facial biometrics, it's all neural network based matching, whether it's facial liveness or facial matching as such. We are also seeing a trend that is moving towards fingerprint based, neural network based matching, and soon iris will follow as a third modality. So having said that, giving you this kind of a baseline, right, now we actually enter into the standards and why they are important. Having seen what all innovation is happening around the world, we believe that standards are important because they allow open exchange of biometric data. That means whatever data is enrolled into one system can be reused into the other system. We want to ensure also that through the standards, all the biometric systems are tested well so that their performance can be compared. So when you have a system that is being deployed for a particular operation as enrolling into a central identity, like we have done in Aadhaar, and then the great example would be the Aadhaar-enabled payment system of NPCI, right? If you want to ensure that the same database gets used for authentication transactions, you want to ensure that it meets certain minimum quality levels, and that's where standards are important. It's also important to know how results are calculated and what baseline is being followed, and obviously define various different methods for assessing the quality of biometric data that's captured and collected. And then last but not the least, you also want to ensure that data that is captured from one system is interoperable with data that is captured from the other system. So which are the bodies that are today formulating standards for biometrics, right? When it comes to biometrics, FBI, like I said, was the pioneer with the forensic technology. They partnered with NIST, which is a National Institute of Standards and Technology, and they have been doing this for really long, right? Maybe quite a few years now. And while NIST concentrates on finger, face, iris, palm, there is palm vein, finger vein, and some other technologies, including also DNA, each and every modality has a different path under NIST. Now, after that evolution that happened with FBI and NIST, we also saw that the ISO standards body got into the picture while defining the quality of the images that are being captured. When we say quality of images, ISO actually defines different standards for quality of capture based on the fingerprint or iris or facial modality. When it comes to fingerprint specifically, we have seen that there are two standards that are being followed all over the world. One is the fingerprint image quality standard, and the other one is the fingerprint template standards. So again, comparing it with the example of Aadhaar, while you're enrolling into a database, when you want to do a deduplication, the database size is so large, right? It's almost 1.3 billion today. You want to ensure that it's fast deduplication, at the same time it's accurate deduplication. That's where most of the technologies that are deployed are proprietary, right? When I say proprietary, that's basically a company's own secret, but that helps you to do a quick and fast deduplication. But once it is deduplicated and it has to get used, say for doing AEPS or any other kind of an authentication, there is the ISO template that gets formed from the same fingerprint image. So whenever we go and buy a SIM card today, right, and they ask us to give an Aadhaar number and then they scan our fingerprint, they are not actually matching the proprietary templates. They are actually matching the ISO template of the fingerprint, right? Or even if they are taking the image, it's in the ISO format. Because when you talk about verifying, you are actually verifying 1:1, the Aadhaar number and your live fingerprint with the fingerprint that is stored into the database. And when you do a 1:1 matching, it has to be standardized. And that's where the ISO standards come into picture. So that's as far as fingerprint is concerned. When we look at facial, what has happened is, while there are image standards that are very well written down for facial, there is no standard for template. One thing that all of us should understand is any biometric system, right? When you talk about matching, you never really match the images that are captured. You match a binary format of that image that is captured, be it facial, finger, palm, vein, or whatever that is. Like I said, in case of fingerprints, it's very well defined because there has been a path to defining that. In case of facial, the images, yes, there is a standard out there, but for templates, it's all proprietary today, wherever you go. In case of iris, again, the image is what is standardized. It is kind 7 images, and then you use your algorithms to match it. So that's just a brief on how ISO is formulating it right now. In India, what happened is when the Aadhaar project started, they basically wanted to ensure what kind of standards they look at, not only from a back-end template or image perspective, but also the acquisition devices perspective. So when they went about it, they actually have drawn inspiration from the NIST or the FBI standards, where on the capture side, when we all have gone and given our fingerprints or facial images or iris images, they ensured that the devices which are being deployed over there, they were compliant to a certain minimum standard, and only then they would be allowed to get deployed, which is where the STQC or the Standardization Testing and Quality Certification Directorate, which is based in Delhi, they came into picture. And they formulated a baseline standard which said that if your devices are compliant to so and so specification, they will actually be allowed to enter into a lab testing. And then once the lab testing is passed by using certain different artifacts, you will then be allowed to go ahead and start deploying it into the field. That ensured that all the data that gets captured is uniform and also meets the quality standards that are set down by the entity. There is also a parallel track that's happening with FIDO. I'm pretty sure all of us have heard about FIDO, but probably I'm not sure how much of us fully understand it. But FIDO stands for Fast Identity Online. It's primarily a standard that so far was not looking at biometrics as such. They were more interested in ensuring that whatever device is being used is actually belonging to you, and then they run on the PKI infrastructure. But our research has shown that FIDO is also now interested in looking at biometric standards. So we'll see what happens on that and how they want to adopt those. But that's something that's also coming up pretty soon in this space. There are other organizations that are also helping or supporting to build standards around biometrics, and this is also specifically related to the changes that are happening in the market, So ID 2020 was formed as a group post-COVID to really look at good health pass and COVID passes, vaccination certificates, if those could be standardized. European Association for Biometrics has been an association that has been looking at various different standards. They conduct workshops, predominantly looking at the European market. Similar is Biometric Institute. They also cover a more global platform. OIX is something which is an open identity exchange, which is more relevant to digital identity, because when you talk about a digital ID, you are today looking at basically the relying party wanting to trust identity provider. In case of India, it's the UIDAI, to ensure that when a person comes to avail a particular service from that relying party, they know that this ID will only be issued by the trusted identity provider, and then they can actually go ahead and authenticate it without having any doubts on that. So again, OIX is a group where there are ideas that are exchanged, and then they are trying to see if they can formulate a global standard pretty soon. Let's look at this example, right? I put this on specifically on this slide to show you what happens when the quality is not up to the mark, right? And as we know, as the world goes mobile, you're no more in a studio environment where the photographer asks you to tilt your head, look at a particular angle, has a background. We are increasingly getting into a space where selfies are being captured on your mobile phone, which would typically then get used to authenticate and then perform transactions. These are some of the examples that if you are wearing a mask or a sunglass or something, these are actually not meeting the ISO specs, right? Whatever is being displayed on those screens are actually standards, actually parameters that are defined in this standard. And whatever we have shown here is, if at all any of the parameter does not meet, then it's actually flagging it off as a red, so that you know that it's not meeting that specific parameter. And unless and until it meets it, the technology would not allow you to go forward. So the point is, there are technologies evolving out there which are also looking at, no matter what your acquisition device is, can we actually go and start meeting standards? Coming to liveness, since we are talking about facial, one of the most important thing to guarantee that a particular transaction is genuine is to conduct facial liveness. This is especially important as we have started seeing more and more digital onboardings that are happening using facial technology. And that is where there is this laboratory iBeta. This is just one of the many laboratories that are out there in the world. There are a few others. One is in Switzerland, one is in Australia, who actually go ahead and look at technologies, and then they are giving out a conformance certificate saying that a particular technology is ISO IEC 30107-3 compliant. There are various levels in that. When we talk about PAD1, that is a presentation attack detection 1, it's basically detecting the most basic attacks, right? And I'll show you some of those in the next slide. It typically means that I'm trying to spoof the system by showing a photo of a photo, or I'm trying to show a cardboard cutout or something of that sort, or a high definition image on the screen. PAD level 2 goes more deeper, where they talk about detecting facial masks, various different artifacts and all. There is a level 3 that's out there, which so far, as per our knowledge, we have not seen anybody being level 3 certified. I think they're also designing test cases on how to actually detect that, but that relates to more deepfake attacks. But there are already technologies out there which are ISO level 1 and level 2 certified that guarantee you that today when you do a facial transaction, you are able to detect those kind of attacks and ensure that the entire transaction is spoof-proof. These are some of the examples that I was talking of. If you look at all of these, they are actually all fakes, right? All spoofs. So one is a large cardboard cutout, the first one. The second one is from a high definition screen. The third one is again a cutout but held at an angle. And the fourth one is actually a real person and a cutout, both trying to spoof it, so that sometimes what happens is technologies, they may detect the real person over there and half of the other person is actually a spoof, right? This is actually trying to get ahead of people who try to spoof technologies and figure out how can we actually go ahead and detect these. And these all get covered under the standards or the ISO certifications that I spoke about earlier. So whatever I spoke so far was related to quality and liveness. But once the capture is done, right, the other important thing is how do you measure the accuracy of the algorithms? And this is where there are other, I would say, evaluation tests. And also, you may not really call them standards, but this is really NIST who is having programs out there that say whoever has a matching algorithm and is capable of submitting it for a commercial or a civilian use can go ahead and submit it. So there are various tracks that are there under NIST. For facial, it is typically FRVT. It's basically facial recognition vendor testing. And there are two tracks over there. The first track is doing a 1:1. That's a verification track. And then the other one is doing a 1:n, where n can be a large database, and you want to send an image into the large database and then get the response from it. The accuracy is measured by setting the system at a particular threshold. And these thresholds are typically called as fingerprint, it's called as false match rates and false non-match rates. What that means is that I will decide as to what should be the false match rate of the system that I want to allow. Right? Typically for facial, when NIST tested, they allow 1 in a million false match. And then when you set that system at 1 in a million, how many are you actually rejecting? That defines the accuracy. So if I set my system at 1 in a million false match acceptance rate and assume that I give you a false non-match rate of say 3%, right? That means I'm actually having an accuracy rate of 99.7%. Right? That's how it actually gets defined, because they look at what error rates are actually being defined in the system. We are very used to going and looking at the commercially available platforms where we submit 2 images and they give us back a percentage score, right? Saying these two are 95% accurate. But most of us don't know how to interpret it, because those systems don't give you the probability of whether the two people are not the same. Is there an error probability in that, right? And that is what NIST actually defines in FRVT. Similar is the case with IREX, which is there for iris evaluation algorithms. The latest one is IREX 10. And these evaluation criteria keep on evolving. And then we move on to fingerprint, where fingerprint, since has been a legacy, there have been many different evaluations that are there. PFT2, PFT3 are applicable to proprietary fingerprint technologies because they are important from a 1:n matching perspective. But we have MINEX that is there over there, which is really the key standard for interoperability. So when I spoke about ISO templates being able to match and all, today when you go to STQC and if you just open up their specification, they will say that the algorithm that is used to extract the template, that is the binary format of the fingerprint from the image, should be MINEX compliant, right? And MINEX actually goes and evaluates all of these algorithms to ensure that they are fully compliant, so that whatever template gets extracted from one algorithm is interoperable with the template that is extracted from the other algorithm or a third-party sensor or a device that is out there, right? So that's where MINEX becomes very crucial. ELFT is more related to your latent fingerprint, so that's more related to the criminal or the law enforcement sector. So having said that, this is how a typical standard compliance would look like. I showed you the screens where there was non-compliance. But assuming that everything goes fine on a mobile phone, all the parameters are green, background is uniform, eyes are open, lighting is good. And these parameters can be tweaked, right, depending on the use case. And this is what we are also discussing with certain bodies where you no more are in a studio environment. What kind of leeway do the companies have when it comes to defining what parameters or what thresholds should we set? But this is actually a live example where this has been deployed. All the parameters are meeting, you accept the image, and then you use that image to submit it to a liveness system and also submit it to a matching system. Assuming that this had not met, in today's scenario where we have neural networks, it really doesn't matter so much because neural networks are powerful enough to match even certain non-compliant images. But trying to submit this to a legacy database, you will always have a challenge where if the image is not as per the required guidelines, it may fail in a liveness scenario or in a matching scenario. Similar is the case with fingerprints. This is actually a touchless or a contactless capture, where you also have got, below you see the values, which are the NFIQ values. So that's another standard, or it's an open source library that's available from NIST, which actually says that NIST fingerprint image quality. And they have defined this. The earlier one was NFIQ1, which has been superseded by NFIQ2, where they have scores ranging from 20 to 100, and then the highest is the best quality, the lowest, that is 20, is the worst quality. So anybody could really pick up those libraries and integrate into the application to ensure that whatever image gets captured is as per the NIST defined image quality standards. I'll touch a bit on MOSIP. It's an interesting topic because this is what is being adopted across the world for civil ID systems. It's basically an open source platform that is funded by various different bodies. It's a philanthropic funded digital public good initiative. It enables countries to really issue digital IDs to their residents. It also ensures that there is an authentication module so that the issued digital IDs can be used for authentication. And one other thing that it does is it avoids any proprietary vendor lock-in. What it means is that it's basically a robust and secure platform. It's being currently hosted under the IIITB initiative in India, but it's being funded by Bill and Melinda Gates, NORAD Foundation, Tata Trust, and Omidyar Network as of today. As I said, it's basically a platform which sits like a middleware. It has an enrollment module of its own, which is fully open source. The code is open source. It's got a middleware. And then for technologies which they need, they actually reach out to private players, and then they get those technologies from the private players, which means that on the device side, if you want to have a capture technology, which can be contact-based or contactless based, they will reach out to private players to bring in that. But those private players have to be compliant to the standards that are defined by them when they are implementing it at a national level. And on the back-end side, if you remember the slide I showed where after the capture you have the identification phase, right, the 1:n, that's where they are reaching out to various different players like the ABIS players, which typically are private players deploying the platform or the engine. That's where again they ensure that the ABIS players are compliant to standards so that whatever data is being captured at the front end, after passing through the middleware, goes to the back end, does a deduplication process, and a clear-cut unique ID number is issued, which can be in the form of a credential, or it can be just a number which can then be reused for authentication purpose. So this is how it's built. They went with a platform approach, open source, standards compliant, again very important, trying to keep it vendor neutral, and I think they have been also successful at that. Leveraging global expertise, we have experts who have implemented Aadhaar who are contributing to the MOSIP platform. We all from our industry are also contributing to the same. They are using a system integrator based approach where they design the platform and they give it to the country. Beyond that, the country decides whether they want to go with a system integrator or they want to implement on their own. And that also helps them for an efficient rollout, because once you standardize what kind of a hardware needs to be deployed, you could actually go ahead and purchase it off the market. Or you could just go ahead and do some kind of an easy customization at the back end to integrate more technologies in it. These are some of the standards related to digital ID. More or less, this is what I spoke about earlier. If you saw, it's OIX, ID20, and NIST 2020. There is one other body, that is the European body, that is EIDAS. They are actually coming up with their own framework or standards where they are asking the companies who are in the digital identity space to comply to that. It's not yet fully out. As you can imagine, the digital identity space is quite evolving. It's a new buzzword. There are various companies taking a look at it in various different ways. And that's where I would really like to introduce you to the next half of the presentation, which is, like I said, there is a clear-cut transition underway for digital identities. Obviously, contactless biometrics are underpinning them. But there is a reason for this, right? Why is the market talking about digital ID? When we say that, it's because the market over there is projected to double to about almost $50 billion by 2026, right? So there is a lot to offer in this space, but at the same time, when you're saying there is a lot to offer, right? At how and at what cost, right? I'm sure a lot of people would be familiar with this image. This is a typical digital driver's license, but it's being shown on a mobile phone and just as a rendering, right? But then what are we really talking about? Are people across the world, or are people in India also today equipped to go ahead and actually start showing the digital form of an ID, right? Because there are still 1 billion people with no legal form of identity. We have about 1.5 billion adults who are unbanked. today. So there is a lot to be done, and 1 in 3 adults don't still have a bank account. It's a different case in India today with the Jan Dhan and all, thanks to the initiatives that we have taken. But then this is actually a number that's coming from World Bank, from their ID4D initiative. So that really begs the question as to when we talk about inclusion, right? What are we really saying? Is inclusion just giving a bank account? Or actually after giving a bank account, you want to ensure that that bank account gets used? And that's where the fintechs come into picture, right? Today when we talk about really giving or solving the problem with the last mile connectivity and banking, we want to ensure that we are bridging the gap over here. And we want to bridge the gap in such a way that you also want to ensure that the identity of the person is actually maintained while passing on the services or the banking or the fintech services to them. So what should be a digital ID, right? Or what is a digital ID rather? All of us are kind of familiar with this. At some point in time, we would have created, I am almost sure that all of us have a Gmail ID. Some of us may have a Facebook ID, Outlook, online banking. All of these platforms are some form of a digital ID, but then are they secure? Do they guarantee you that your passwords cannot be stolen? Do they guarantee you that OTPs cannot be compromised? That's not the truth, right? So moving on to this, right? This is the latest thing that we have seen in the last 2 years during COVID, where you have kind of COVID passes. You also have got boarding passes that are very common today. All of these are actually some or the other form of digital IDs, right? And they may be standardized, they may not be standardized in some form. But what we believe is what a digital ID should ideally be is something like this, right? And this relates to my earlier slide where I was talking about a service provider / relying party actually trusting the identity provider to ensure that the identity provider has given an identity to the claimant or the end user, which the user can then come to the service provider and show to avail the service. So I'll not go into each and every, the characteristic of a digital ID over here, but some of the important thing is obviously it should be inclusive. It should be reusable so that once it is issued, you should not be allowed, or you should not be required to go and create a new one each and every time. We have seen that in some cases where websites allow you to log in your Gmail account or a Facebook account. It should be self-sustaining. The other important thing is that it should not be tracked, should be controlled by the user, because we are also seeing a lot of talk around privacy and decentralized identity that's coming up in the market. So these are becoming quite important. And when we talk about it from a biometric perspective, why not it be biometrically verified, right? Why just have it as a device-binded identity? Because today, even when you have a Face ID or you have a Touch ID, I could potentially go and enroll my fingerprint on somebody else's phone and then still create frauds, right? Because it allows me to enroll 10 fingers. I can enroll one of them as mine, while it can be somebody else's fingerprint. So it should be more than just a physical form of a digital ID. We have seen a lot of technologies out there, right, which say that we have a digital ID, but it should not be that you're taking a picture of your driver's license or your passport and showing it as a digital ID, right? It should be much more than that. Just digressing from this topic, I'm pretty sure most of you would be knowing, right? There is a clear difference between these two documents. What you see on the right side is actually a dumb driver's license, as you may call it. It has no chip, nothing, no intelligence in it. But on the left-hand side, it's a US passport, which has a chip in it. India is soon launching its e-passports. But this is actually a form of a digital ID. When you talk about e-passports, you can actually verify the details that are there inside it, biometrically also, right? So that's the basic difference that we are talking about here. And having said that, we are looking at a new form of a digital ID. This is what I actually wanted to leave you with, where there are exciting things happening in this space where you could actually look at a game changer in reusable digital identities that once it is issued, it can actually get reused to perform authentications or verifications biometrically. And this today has a capability of storing your compressed face image, a face template, 2 fingerprint templates, and biographic data purely on the particular high-density machine-readable code that you see over there. And that can then sit in your wallet, can be printed on a card, can be printed on a piece of paper, and carried along with you to ensure that you are presenting it when it is required. This is a small demo of how it would look like. Just time check, I'm okay. Yep. So this is actually scanning the identity. You see the compressed face photo, giving you an option to do a verification. Imagine this being a merchant scenario where the merchant has a smartphone, the person on the other side actually presented an ID. There is a facial matching that is being done with the data that was stored in that ID. It does not hit any central database, right? So you don't need to have any kind of a central connectivity over there. And also topped up with fingerprint biometrics. So it allows you to do a multimodal biometrics today. When we talk about this thing, right, the important thing to consider here is the data that gets inside the digital ID, right? When we spoke about the slides regarding to standards, as long as the data that is getting into it complies to some or the other standard, this kind of an ID could be deployed for various different use cases. Can be any, right? I mean, there are many different use cases that could really come up with. Looking at the digital ID lifecycle, this slide is similar to the one that I had shown you on the first slide, where you have a typical registration or an enrollment that takes place. But when you talk about innovative technologies, it comes down to also doing a self-registration or self-enrollment. You could sit at your home and do it. You don't need to get into an enrollment center, where the data gets captured and then passed on to the backend to perform data validations. Can be a deduplication check. Can be a check where you're scanning your ID, capturing your face, matching the face that is captured live with the face that is there on the identity, and then proceeding forward to the issuance of that ID, which, like I said, can be in a digital format, sitting in a wallet, or can be in a physical format, or can come on your mail, and then you can use it the way you want, and then subsequently using that ID that is issued to perform verification transactions when you're actually doing it either in a self-service environment where I load the ID from my wallet and I self-authenticate, or I can actually go and present it to somebody and the merchant is able to authenticate. And then obviously there is the entire life cycle management of that identity where you want to revoke it or renew it and all of those things. This is a depiction of an offline verification. Like we have shown in the video, I won't get into too many details, but it's as simple as you don't need to connect to any central database, because essentially the matching that you're doing is the live picture, that is the live photo or the fingerprint, being matched with the data that is stored inside the digital ID, which sits with you, right? And that's the key, because then you're talking about privacy being maintained. You're going to present it when you want it with your full consent and able to perform an offline 1:1 authentication. A lot of people say that it can be copied. Yeah, sure, it can be copied, but then it's also secured because it can be generated by the identity provider. When you copy it, you do not have libraries that can easily decode it, because you need to authorize agents or merchants to actually go ahead and start decoding it. Again, those can be standards based depending on how the country goes about it. It's up to the country and the regulators to really define what kind of standards do they want to ensure. And the data can obviously be encrypted using the PKI methodology that's there. Just to talk on this, so this is actually an innovative digital container which is able to store a lot of data in it and also be in a very small size. It typically does not have the 3 indicators that you would be very familiar with a QR code, right? So it can actually start reading anywhere, can read blocks of data, can stop reading at blocks of data. So if an entity wants to authorize agents to read only specific data, you can actually stop over there. Like we said, it's got triple level of protection. The first one is that not anybody can read it. The second one is that the data inside it itself can be encrypted. And the third thing is you actually authorize who can actually go ahead and start reading it and decoding it. And obviously, as of today, we can store facial fingerprint, facial templates, fingerprint templates, but it also has the capability to store voice, has capability to store iris templates potentially, and then use that for authentication mechanisms later on. So having said that, we wanted kind of to spark the enthusiasm and say how can it change the world of fintech and banking, right? There are all these technologies coming out there. So this is just an example that we are seeing, that it's a typical paradox, right? That a person wants to go and avail a banking service, and then you are asked to prove your identity, and then you usually would rely on some physical documents or something. But imagine that you can actually do this by just showing an identity. The banking agent is actually enabled to verify it. you get your service and you are happy, the banking agent is happy, they are able to keep the customers with them. This can be in a face-to-face environment or can also be in a remote environment, and that's where the remote authentication piece comes into picture, where imagine that you are accessing your net banking account. Today you use your user ID and password, potentially an OTP if the bank is allowing an OTP to be sent to your mobile phone. But imagine that you could actually see the digital ID on your screen, and then the control gets passed to your mobile phone where you're asked to open an app, scan that identity, and then authenticate yourself in a self-service environment, and then a token gets passed back where the transaction gets completed, or the transaction from the net banking directly goes to your app and you are doing a self-scanning and a self-uploading of the digital identity and scanning. So the real question, right, that we need to ask is to what extent, right, that the customers would like to adopt this, because on one side when you want to deploy technologies like this, you also want to look at security, but you also want to look at the convenience that is there for the customer. And we believe that there are clear-cut benefits in doing this, because one is that from security perspective, the customer really decides where the ID can be accessed and by whom, and with full consent. Right? You basically have biometrically linked to it, so you know that even if the ID gets stolen or lost, nobody will be able to use it because it's fully secured. And the third thing is you can even obviously authenticate in your private environment, so that you don't have to actually go ahead and share it with anybody, if at all that's also required. So today when we talk about digital identity and banking, all of us are pretty much aware of biometric onboarding, right? We have seen video KYC being a norm in India. There are a lot of companies doing that. Or it can be just be a government ID issued KYC. But once the KYC is done, that's where the real fun begins, right? Because that is where you can actually start using the technology to perform transactions. And when it is linked biometrically to your facial or to your fingerprints, it actually helps us to perform the transactions faster. There is another concept that is being talked about in the industry, and that's about the derived digital identity, where after the proof of identity is established from the trust anchor, right, where you do your AML checks, you do your credit scoring checks and all of those things, the organization who is actually performing those checks or who is actually availing those services can decide to derive their own digital identity, and then that digital identity can be circulated to their customers so that it becomes specific to that particular organization, rather than going and latching into a central service provider every single time. It also helps the entities to actually go ahead and give other services along with it. Having said that, I will close my presentation going through this particular use case. So we were given an opportunity by NPCI to participate in Payoff Challenge last year. And we responded to that with a solution that's related to the digital identity to ensure strong authentication. As we all know today, UPI is clocking billions of transactions, and that is also requiring it to have a strong identity binding. That's where we proposed the T5 digital ID for UPI authentication. I won't get into the detail. On the left side, you see it's quite a busy thing. But just to walk you through the workflow, a typical registration would look like you open your UPI app, and while you are about to create your UPI ID, it always gets linked to your debit card and via your debit card to your bank account. So while doing that, we all know that we can open a bank account only when a KYC is done. Right? And while doing that KYC, the bank actually has our facial photograph already captured. So you could utilize that facial photograph to go ahead and register yourself. And that's the first time that you capture a live selfie from the app. And the app has got the SDKs integrated into it that allow you to perform quality checks, allow you to perform liveness checks. The image that gets captured gets sent to the bank. As an issuer, the bank verifies it with a technology that is deployed over there at the bank level. Once the facial matching is successful, it allows you to go ahead and generate a digital ID in the form of the machine-readable code that we showed, which then can sit into the UPI wallet across that particular VPA that is created. So you can have multiple cryptographs or multiple digital IDs created for multiple different bank accounts and multiple VPAs. And once those are created, you have to only use them for basically doing the push or the pull transactions. What it would typically comprise of today is this is what we are talking about, right? User selfie, a facial template, UPI address potentially against which it is being enrolled, and a digital signature to secure it. And then you can actually also have a bank account linked to it so that you can identify that this is related to a specific bank account or a UPI address. A typical push transaction workflow would look like this, where when you want to make a payment transaction, today when you open up your UPI app, you key in the amount, you select the merchant or you select the payee, and you pay the money to them. Before payment, it asks you to do enter your 4-digit UPI PIN. Right? Just before it asks you to enter your 4-digit UPI PIN, imagine that it's actually asking you to scan or upload your cryptograph or the digital ID that is linked to that particular bank account, or it is able to pick it up automatically from that UPI address. It picks it up, decodes on the phone, decodes the facial template that is there inside it along with the selfie, asks you to capture your live selfie, matches it with the data that is there inside the digital ID, and then once that is matched, asks you to enter your PIN and then proceed to the transaction. Right? By introducing this small step, we have been able to do a multi-factor authentication. And this can either be done in a purely offline manner, where you don't have any connectivity when you don't want to send the entire facial data to a server, or it could potentially also be done online, where the facial data can be sent to the server, the digital ID could be decoded over there, and the issuer can authorize it and then finish the transaction. The same case can be in the case of, a pull transaction, where there are two scenarios, right? That you are face to face with somebody and you are collecting money, and that's where you want to authenticate them. And this is where it actually shines, where when you're collecting money from somebody, the other person wants to know, especially if you're not face to face, the guarantee that this is coming from a genuine person and not somebody who has initiated it because he's got access to certain phone or access to a VPA, right? So when it comes to in a remote location, you would follow all the same steps that you would do when you open up an UPI app, and you would ask for a collect request. You key in your VPA, ask from whom you want the collect request, and before you enter the PIN again, you will be asked to scan your ID, scan your live face, do a matching. Once the matching is done, the proof of that would be attached into the messaging format that would be sent to the other party from where you're collecting the money. On the other side, the party gets the message saying, collect request has arrived. Do you want to authorize it? But then you will also see that on the collect request, it will say that it's verified biometrically. That gives the assurance that this is being coming from a genuine person and not somebody who is a spoof or trying to fraud the system. And only then, when you are authenticating, even at your end, you will be prompted to do the same, because you would have created your digital ID on your own, so that from an auditing purpose also, at both the ends, whenever you want to audit the transactions or if there is a dispute, you actually have the proof of biometrically verifying the transactions at both the collector's end as well as the person who is paying the transaction. Yep. So I'll leave you with a couple of more slides. So some of the advantages, it's privacy by design, where you decide what you own. The cryptograph lies with you. It's a fully decentralized identity. You do not need to actually go and latch onto a central database after the first issuance is done. Issuance is always centralized for security reasons, but verification can be fully decentralized. Strong identity binding, where it's being bound to you irrespective of which phone do you use, right? So today you may be able to do a UPI transaction on any other phone as long as you have the identity with you. You don't need your own phone today. Can be in a physical or a digital format. So even if you don't have a phone and you still want to prove your identity to perform a transaction, you could do that by showing it on a piece of paper. Verification can be purely offline in areas where you don't have connectivity, but you can also do this online in case that is the mandate or the regulatory requirement. And then it basically can be usable for 1:1 authentication using multimodal transactions. And like I said, right, you could potentially get enrolled into the system by sitting in the comfort of your home. You don't need to get into any specific enrollment center. There are multiple biometric modalities that can be programmed into it. Like I said, liveness checking ensures that when you're using facial matching or facial technology, the system cannot be defrauded. And you could actually generate multiple digital IDs or cryptographs, which can be linked to various different accounts. And the entire process can be conducted in a fully contactless manner, either in a self-service environment or in a merchant environment. Thank you for that.